Good Monday morning, Northstate. Preston, Donion here in the Weather Center with your July 21st update on Northstate fires, including the Green and Butler Fires. We're going to take a close look at their perimeters, hotspots, and what you need to know heading into today. I'll try and keep this one a little bit shorter, so we're going to zoom in on the Green Fire and go through the important information. You are seeing this last mapped over 19,000 acres and containment at 51% as of Sunday. I expect that number to change and increase as we head here into the later portions of Monday, but I want to talk about a couple things that we're seeing. We talked about all week last week, this line here, right along Rip Gut Ridge, all the way down to the Pitt River. That was that containment line. Crews started fire here to contain the growth of the fire naturally to the east, as those winds would aid the fire in that direction. And so we are still seeing a couple little isolated hotspots in the Rip Gut Creek drainage, but that fire line has held to this point, and they're going to continue to reinforce that throughout the day, with a big focus on also, of course, maintaining the fire here on the north side of the Pitt River, where the fire kind of spread its way down. We saw that final creeping down to the water line in a couple spots over the weekend, and you did see a little progression here along the southwest flank of the fire, but for the most part, a pretty darn quiet 24-hour period here. And today's really about making sure that in the face of those slightly stronger winds, we're not seeing spot fires jump out and they're putting out some of those larger clusters of heat that are still within the fire perimeter. But overall, a pretty positive story. You don't see many hot spots, and while in this case, I think that's reflective of the fact that the fire has been shut down pretty successfully in a lot of places, it's not necessarily the case on the Butler Fire, and we'll talk about that now. So we'll shift over to western Siskiyou County and take a look at that Butler Fire perimeter. Very complex, right? You've got really two fire areas to look at. This is the main one, right? It started somewhere around here initially with that lightning strike in early July, and then we've seen some pretty progressive spreading since then. So here's what we're seeing with that perimeter. You've got this main fire that's spread and had some pretty impressive runs at times, and then you have the spot fire. We mentioned this on Friday. This happened on Thursday night. You saw this spot across the Salmon River here and establish itself pretty well in what is the Crapo Creek drainage. Now this runs up onto Yellow Jacket Ridge. So that's kind of this ridge line that continues up here, and you've got a road. And if that jacket sounds familiar, right around this vicinity is where the Jacket Fire, which was one of the smaller, or at least relatively small, lightning fires popped up earlier when these lightning strikes had recently happened, that first week of July. So we had the Jacket Fire here, burned about 40 acres, and that one's well controlled. But it's in that same area as now the Butler Fire that's made a pretty established run across that side of the Salmon River. So we have seen the fire creep its way down the hillside, down Yellow Jacket Ridge to the road here, Sawyer's Bar Road. They mentioned in their morning update there have been two spots where that fire has made it down to the road. And this runs along the North Fork of the Salmon River. That continues this way to Sawyer's Bar, and then just for that reference, this down here is Cecilville Road that runs you to Cecilville, a little bit further off to the south and east. So we are seeing that fire activity really push down to Sawyer's Bar Road, a couple hot spots there over the top of the ridge and down along the road, and of course the core of the community of Forks of Salmon is kind of in this vicinity, right where the forks of the river meet. And so there's obviously been a lot of work to protect structures in that area. You can see that the fire perimeter does not include that core of town, and so I think that's been a huge focus for fire crews, and some point of solace to know, okay, we're seeing that fire crews have been up against incredibly challenging conditions, right? Because we get impressive winds kind of funneled here down the Salmon River Canyon. This valley is just a funnel for that wind, and so it can be really challenging, and that's why you see some of that strong uphill running tendency for the fire. And the active fire behavior still expected to continue today. Some things working a little bit more in favor of fire crews is that we have some really good ocean influence out there. We're going to get some good westerly wind. We're carrying air in off of the Pacific, and so what you're going to see is, yes, that westerly wind is going to be a little breezier today than it has been, and that's going to be a difficulty for fire crews. But in terms of overnight behavior, we've seen really good humidity recovery, and so that air is moist. Fuels aren't as primed to ignite as they have been otherwise to this point in the month. And of course, you've also got cooler temperatures when we get that ocean influence. And so overnight, fire activity may moderate, and that may allow crews to really get in the places they need to be, get those containment lines established, and get out there and try to kind of work on contingency as well. So it's still, the fire is out there, it's in control. Fire crews are on defense as it stands. We're only at 6% containment on this fire, now over 17,000 acres. But this is a slight positive in terms of weather, at least in that dimension of humidity and temperatures. The winds, still a concern. And those winds are what gave way to some pretty impressive spread to the south here on the other side of the Salmon River, here on the west side of it. So here's what happened. What we saw was fire activity continue to creep this way, and it made its way into this drainage here, and I have to reference over to my other map really quickly just to make sure I'm getting the names right, so do bear with me for just a second. So McNeil Creek, that is where we saw the fire activity here, right? It had a pretty good run into McNeil Creek, and you've got some small rural roads that run through this area, but the fire kind of crossed down into McNeil Creek drainage, and it spread its way up the hill. Fire loves to run uphill. Think about that, right? That heat rises up the hill surface, and so it's going to ignite faster on its way uphill than it does downhill. And that push uphill, aided by the wind and of course the way that temperature works, sent some spots over the top, and this is down here now into Know Nothing Creek. And I know that's a kind of an interesting name, but yes, Know Nothing, K-N-O-W, nothing, Know Nothing. And so we see this run up the ridge and then down into the drainage, and that's where the last perimeter mapping happened. And we're gonna just zoom in on that, and I'll show you. You can see in some finer detail that indeed they've mapped some of that kind of creeping over the top of the ridge and moving its way down. Now, downhill motion in fire is going to happen at all times. It probably works a little bit better under those overnight conditions, and so I think in a new mapping, whenever we can get that, you're probably going to have seen that fire progress this way down towards Know Nothing Creek. But we've also seen this push here along the ridge all the way down to Cecilville Road, and so up along this ridge, there has been some significant fire activity, and of course, you think about the winds funneling out of the northwest, pushing that air southeast, you're going to see that driving of the fire in this direction, and that allowed for it to continue its way down to the road. So we have seen the roads as these, main lines of potential hold for fire crews be challenging, and fires running all the way down to those road surfaces, and so that's a big concern. And I want to zoom back out just to kind of talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of those hotspots. And again, I mentioned, don't take the lack of bright red new hotspots out there as a sign that the fire activity has moderated. While I think we may have a slightly less significant growth day to day than we saw yesterday, which in itself was slightly smaller than Saturday. That was that biggest day of growth on the fire to this date, added about 2,300 acres in a 24-hour period there. While I think this is going to be a slightly lesser day, I do think that this isn't reflecting the full truth. Because we had significant cloud cover over the region, the satellites that fly over and try to see where those hotspots are can't penetrate through that cloud cover, and so this really doesn't tell the full story. You can definitely see hotspots mapped yesterday that show activity all along that spot fire here along the North Fork portion of the fire, and then you do see some activity here kind of creeping a little further west, running its way up ridge tops. And so we are concerned about communities here in far western Siskiyou County. Of course, Forks of Salmon, an area that has seen an evacuation order for days, and that's really right in the heart of the fire in terms of surrounded by the mapped perimeter, and hotspots have kind of shown up around the community itself. So we know that structure protection is going to be one of the main focuses for crews in that area, and I wouldn't take these perimeters as gospel in terms of what's happened. If you zoom in on a map like this and see your house in that area, that may not reflect the full truth, and of course it doesn't always reflect the exact status of the fire right now. While you may not see that fire close to your road, your street, your home, whatever, that may not be the full truth. So you got to make sure you take this with a grain of salt if you are in one of those fire zones. So that's what we're seeing there. I'm going to shift you now quickly to that fire perimeter just to take one more quick look at how complex this is. Take off those hotspots and give you a chance to see the geometry of this and how the landscape, how the hills and valleys have really played in the fire's favor to allow it to make some strong runs at times, something I think we'll continue to see thanks to those still breezy winds out there. And that's what's showing up when we move through into the afternoon here, right? You've got that kind of northwest breeze, and that's going to be channeled right down that Salmon River kind of flow into that drainage. And so we are going to be concerned about that wind out of the northwest pushing fire activity to the southeast here in far western Siskiyou County. Throughout the rest of the region, winds are pretty similar to what they've been in recent days, just maybe a little bit stronger, right? You're getting south winds up the valley floor, turning southwesterly. And so along the Green Fire, that's why they're concerned about that eastern boundary, because we have winds out of the southwest, so that's going to push the fire to the northeast. And that's the expectation for today. We head through into the night, and you see those winds generally weaken out there, and that is a positive, right? But you're still seeing that onshore flow along the coast, and that'll allow for some good moist air to show up. Finally, taking a quick look at that smoke, you are seeing it centered over top of the Butler Fire. That's really where most of the bad air quality is going to be found. Western Siskiyou County, you do see the Green Fire hardly putting off a ton of smoke anymore, and that's great news for a lot of folks. But we are concerned about both of these fires. Stay safe out there. I'll update you again later on in the week, and we'll have more information on krcrtv.com at all times, all throughout the day and night.